Good morning. I'm in New York. Haoze and Taoyin are in China, so it's morning here. Some of you are joining from the Middle East, so good afternoon, and others in East Asia, good evening to all of you. So this is our second in our lecture series, and this talk is actually a launching of Taoyin's new book that just came out from Oxford University Press, and this is his first talk on the book that is really a very important contribution to the study of the Chinese in India and a specific period of the Second World War. It's a great pleasure to invite Taoyin back to CGA because he was one of the first postdoctoral fellows we had at CGA soon after he had finished his PhD from the National University of Singapore. Taoyin is now an associate professor at Tsinghua University. Unlike many people who take on English name, Taoyin has taken on an Indian name very appropriately because he is one of the leading South Asian historians in China now, Parthasarathi Singh, and he has been pushing many people to pronounce his name, which is not easy to pronounce for himself as well. But Taoyin now has become, as I said, one of the leading scholars, leading young scholars of South Asian history. There are very few of them in China. He works on modern Indian history, global history, and intra-Asian connections. His first book was on the Sikhs in Shanghai. That is why he came to Shanghai to work on his book manuscript, the first one. It was published from Brill in 2018. This is his new book, Chinese Sojourners in Wartime Raj, 1942 to 1945. Here he covers very interesting episodes of Chinese who are present in India, and many of them are not official Chinese. These are subaltern Chinese that he's looking at. So today he will be talking about many of them and giving you some ideas about why this book is worth buying. I welcome all of you to attend this talk and engage with him after his talk is done. So you'll see at the bottom of the Zoom screen a Q&A box as Taoyin or as Professor Singh, let me call him now, is speaking. You can type in your questions. He'll speak for about 40-45 minutes and we'll have a Q&A session. I'll moderate the Q&A. And I see there are some people in the audience who work on the Chinese Indian community. If you want to come onto the screen, just let me know as well. So without further ado, Professor Singh, onto you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So just let me share my screen. Okay, can you see the screen?
Yeah, this is good.
Great. Okay, thank you so much, Tenzin. And actually, I just like Tenzin said, I was the first postdoc at CGA, so it's quite a long time, 5 years or 6 years. 6 years ago, I think it's 2016 when I just got my PhD degree. Then I was so lucky that Tenzin selected me as his first postdoc, and actually I stayed in NYU Shanghai CGA Center for Global Asia for just a few months, but that a few months influenced me a lot. And actually, they say my period of staying in CGA shaped my thoughts and ideas doing my future scholarship greatly. And actually, the seed of this current book was sowed during my period at CGA. So thank you so much, Tenzin, for bringing me here and present my new book, Chinese Sojourners in Wartime Raj, 1942 and 1945. And this book, just like I said, this book is actually come from my first book, which is about the Sikh immigrants in China from late 19th century to early 20th century, right? So when I was writing the last chapter of this book, which is about the Indian National Army, as you can see here, right? And I find an interesting episode. The Subhas Chandra Bose, the great Netaji, right, great Indian revolutionary, in the 20th century. He paid a visit to Nanjing, to China in 1943. And when he was in Nanjing, he broadcasted to his audience across China. He said the Chongqing regime, let's remember, in 1943, Nanjing was the capital of the Wang Jingwei regime, and Subhas Chandra Bose was a friend to Wang Jingwei. So he said the Chongqing regime, ruled by Chiang Kai-shek, betrayed the goodwill of Indians. They sent thousands of Chinese soldiers and hooligans to India to eat the blood of Indians and to help the British imperialists. This very sentence really, interested me at that time when I read them, because who were those Chinese soldiers and hooligans staying in India in 1940s during the Second World War? Who are they? Were they really allies of the British? Would they really eat the blood of Indians? Or what were they doing in India? What were their experience in India, and how Indians reacted to this very Chinese existence in their country? Right. So all of these questions just haunted me and pushed me to write another book, which is this current book, to answer these questions. This book is a very short one, but I think it should be very interesting because it tells a story very little known, very little or limited studied. So that's the contents of the book. As I said, this book is a short book. It's a little book. It is composed of 4 stories in addition to an introduction and a conclusion. The 4 stories are about sailors, smugglers, deserters, and pilots. Most of them are Chinese, but not Chinese citizens. Some of them are Chinese citizens. Some of them, we don't know their nationalities. Maybe they're from Southeast Asia. Maybe they're from Myanmar. Maybe they're from their ancestors came to India decades ago and they end up in India as Indian Chinese. We don't know. But by writing the 4 stories, my argument is short, but very clear here. The argument of this book: the Chinese nationalist government's state building projects in India during World War II provoked British colonial anxieties. And this argument alone is quite powerful, because nobody ever studied that the modern Chinese state building projects ever existed or happened in India. Because as far as we know, India, overseas Chinese, of course, we have a lot of overseas Chinese staying in Southeast Asia, staying in North America, but very few studies have ever been conducted on this very small group of Chinese sojourners or immigrants in India, let alone Chinese state building projects in India, right? And these Chinese state building projects and their interaction with the British colonial authorities in India, partly but significantly, shaped post-war India-China tensions. That's another argument. And this argument is also quite original and powerful because previously our stereotyped understanding of this post-war India-China tensions were attributed to this geopolitics along the Himalayas, right? Across the Tibet and northeastern India. But my argument is that the Chinese state building projects in India during World War II, they also contributed something to this post-war India-China tensions and even today's India-China relations. So let's begin with our first story, the Chinese Seamen's Wartime Service Corps and the 1942 Calcutta Chinese riots. Nowadays, quite a lot of studies has already been done about this Chinese seamen's role, their experiences during World War II, especially their relationship with the British, because we know that a lot of thousands of Chinese seamen worked for the British and working in the British ships during World War II, right? So we can find quite a lot of not only academic articles, but also the public articles about this story. But what is little known is this Chinese seaman's experience in India. Let's read the two pieces of archives and newspaper articles. On the left, we can see the official propaganda article, 中勇的中国海员在印度参加训练 loyal and patriotic Chinese sailors under training in India, right? And there are quite a lot of praising words for how the Chinese government loved these Chinese sailors and how the Chinese sailors sacrificed their lives and be very loyal to the Chinese government during the Second World War, right? And on the right hand, you find a secret classified foreign office archives sent by Chinese consulate in Calcutta back to Chongqing. And in this piece of archives, we found a very different story. It is said that a minority, a few Chinese sailors were very bad. They joined the gamblings and they protest against the government. They even tear down Sun Yat-sen's portraits on the streets of Calcutta, and also Chiang Kai-shek's portraits were teared down by these Chinese sailors. And these Chinese sailors even went to the streets of Calcutta to humiliate the Chinese government. So the two stories were very controversial and very different from one another. Which one is true, right? Is that the Chinese government's official articles, their narratives are true, or is this one the secret and classified archive sent by the foreign consulate, the Chinese consulate were true? My answer is that both of them are not true. Of course, this 忠勇的中国海员在印度 was just a propaganda, was just the government propaganda conducted by the Chinese nationalist government, right? And for this one, it's not the 少数, it's not only a few Chinese sailors went to the street to demonstrate. According to my study, the majority or almost all of them went to the streets to demonstrate, to humiliate their own government, the Chinese nationalist government. So what happened? Why the Chinese sailors went to India, stayed in Calcutta, and humiliated their own government and even tear down Sun Yat-sen and Chiang Kai-shek's portraits in front of the Indians and the British? So the story went back to the outbreak of the Pacific War in 1941. At that time, thousands of Chinese sailors working on British shipping companies, these Blue or Burn Line, or this kind of British shipping companies. So British shipping companies, their line were between India and China, right? But after the outbreak of the Pacific War, the Japanese occupied almost all coastal areas of China and Southeast Asia. So this British shipping company, they cannot go to China anymore, right? Because all of these places were occupied by the Japanese. And these Chinese sailors working for the British shipping companies, they can only stay in India. They were waiting for someday that they got the opportunity can get back to their hometown in China, but now they can only stay in India with very low wages, unable to receive compensation, no repatriation arrangement. Of course, no repatriation arrangement because all repatriation roads were blocked by the Japanese, right? Until 1942 Anglo-Chinese Seamen Agreement. So the 1942 Anglo-Chinese Seamen Agreement is about the Chinese nationalist government try to push the British government to give privileges to the Chinese sailors, because before this, Chinese sailors got very few salaries comparing with their white sellers comparing with the European sellers, right? But after the 1942 Anglo-Chinese Cement Agreement, the British government agreed that all Chinese sellers should get equal pay with these European sellers. But this is not a good news for the Chinese sellers in India. Why? Because the Chinese sellers in India, they got this competition from NASCAR's indigenous local Indian sellers. Let's compare their salaries. One NASCAR sellers, Indian sellers, in the 1940s could get 54 to 75 rupees a month. But Chinese sellers, they expected to get some 65 to 125 rupees a month in 1940s. So if you are a shipping company manager, who you gonna hire if their skill are more or less the same, right? Of course, you're gonna hire some lower salary NASCAR sellers instead of the Chinese one, right? So in India, most of the shipping companies here prefer to hiring these Indian sellers instead of Chinese sellers. So our Chinese sellers were unemployed because they cannot find a job because of their higher salaries, right? So what are they gonna do? They still can get some money from the British shipping companies because according to their contract, the British shipping companies has this obligation to pay the minimum salary to the Chinese sellers until they can send them back to their hometown in China. But now, because the British shipping company cannot send them back to China, they had to pay the minimum 30 rupees a month, the minimum wage for the Chinese sellers, even when they didn't work. So with this small money in hand and they don't need to go to work, what they're gonna do, right? Most of them joined the gambling business in Calcutta. Let's read a piece of archives here, right? One man whose name is Ni An from Calcutta wrote a telegraph to his relatives in Kunming, Changxing, right, in September 1942. And he said the life of the overseas Chinese here in Calcutta is limited and purposeless. Right? There are no other activities apart from gambling, especially mahjong. The seamen are the worst of all. Chinese seamen, worst of all, spending all their time in the gambling dens, many of which have been set up during the past 2 months. Even hairdressers and tailors' shops have been turned over into gambling places. The moment one approached Chinatown, there is no other sound to be heard except the sound of clicking of the mahjong pieces. Recently, some people have been trying to encourage sports in order to lead these people into other interests. So the situation among these Chinese sellers in India, very bad, right? Very bad in 1942. So facing this deteriorating situation among these Chinese sellers in India, what the Chinese and the British authorities gonna do, right? The British authorities and the British shipping companies affiliated with them didn't want to pay any more salaries to these Chinese sellers because they didn't do any job and we have to pay them, although the salaries were very low, 30 rupees a month, but still you need to pay the money, but they didn't do anything, right? And the Chinese authorities here, they were also not very happy with the Chinese sellers here because they did quite a lot of the illegal things, illegal activities in Calcutta, and they caused quite a lot of troubles to the Chinese authorities alike, right? So from February 1942, Chinese and Indian authorities proposed to establish a corps. What corps? The Chinese Seamen's Wartime Service Corps, to try to discipline, train, and put these sailors under control, right? So they have a plan to how to put these Chinese sailors in Calcutta under their control, right? And their plan is that the British government, the British Indian government pay the money and give the land, and the Chinese authorities need to send some categories some military officers and political officers to India, to Calcutta, and cooperate to try to discipline these unemployed Chinese sailors. So the obligation lied on the hand of Wu Tietchen. Wu Tietchen was a former mayor of Shanghai, but at that time he was in charge of CC, Kuomintang intelligence agents, right? So he sent quite a lot of, 20 or 30 Kuomintang categories to India to try to discipline these Chinese sailors. So here we got this Kuomintang archives in Taipei, and there was a connection about this Kuomintang categories who went to India in 1942. When they arrived in Calcutta in 1942, they began their work. They began to register all unemployed Chinese sailors in Calcutta from July 1942. So in August 1942, some 1,710 seamen, Chinese seamen, were registered by the Kuomintang categories. However, still 1,500 showed no interest in even the registration, right? And look, these seamen were only registered, it doesn't mean that they want to go to the corps. They just register, put their name on the roster. That's all. So by the time when the Chinese Seamen's wartime service corps officially launched in September 1942, only 700 seamen were brought to the corps camps in Tunigunga, in southern Calcutta. Here is a map of Calcutta, right? There are two Chinatowns in Calcutta. One in Beau Bazaar, the other one in the suburb of Calcutta is Tangara. But the site this corps was in the southern part of the city, Tunigunga. So only 700. Look, we have at least 3,000 Chinese sailors, right? But only 700 arrived in this corps and under training. You may ask, what kind of training? To learn 三民主义, three principles of the people, 三民主义. To learn Chiang Kai-shek's speech and to learn some basic military skills. So that's all. That's what the training they were under, right? So let's just turn to the archives and see some personal views of this corps. Here we find the telegraph sent by Chong Yi, a Chinese sailman staying in Calcutta, to his relatives Han Tingfeng in New York City in November 1942. He said that Chinese Seamen's Wartime Service Corps were recently inaugurated and the maintenance allowance of 30 rupees per month has been stopped, which means that the British shipping company no longer provided the unemployed Chinese seamen 30 rupees a month, right? So he said, I'm not at all interested in the corps, and I'm very unwilling to undergo training in it. I cannot return to China because my village is in occupied territory. And if I return to free China, I shall find it difficult to make a living. I'm still wanting to get work aboard ship. My position is critical and I need your help. Right. Here, again, there's another Chinese sailor in Calcutta. Shi Chou wrote to his relatives Chou Shiwei in 1942. Again, he said, I was going to return to China by plan. But when I was going through the customs, my money was detained. Why his money was detained? We will tell another story. That's another story, right? But not here. He said, I was not permitted to proceed. Later, I joined the Chinese Wartime Service Corps, but the training is so hard that I'm thinking of running away. At the moment, I have no money, so I have to stay on here. So from these personal views, we find most of sailors, Chinese sailors, have no interest in joining this kind of the Chinese Seamen's Corps at all, right? Even those who join the Chinese Corps here in Tunigunga, they want to run away. Okay. So some Chinese sailors who didn't join the corps but stay in Calcutta's Chinatown in Beau Bazaar, most of the Chinese sailors stay in Beau Bazaar in the urban area. Right? They organized their own corps. So here we find some other archives. It is said that these Chinese unemployed Chinese sailors, they have their own organizations, the Quartermasters Club, 海员体育会, the Seamen's Ethnic Association, Seamen's Social Association, 海员语坛会, right? And even some local Chinese businessmen, for example, Wang Fusheng from Shanghai 酒楼, or Li Ruwei from Shanghai 洗衣公司, and Ke Agen from 中央茶室, they began to sponsor these unofficial or non-official seamen organization. Why? Because these people, they were boss of some gambling houses. And if these seamen were brought to the corps, then the gambling houses in Chinatown will be losing their business, right? So these businessmen in Chinatown, they didn't like the corps either. So they begin to support some unsatisfied and frustrated Chinese sailors to organize their own organization, which is Chinese Seamen's Association for the Promotion of Virtue, 中国海员礼义促进会, and against the appeal of the corps, of this Wu Tiechen's corps, right? So there were some conflicts between the two, right? And because of these conflicts, fightings, and quarrels between these unemployed seamen and the Kuomintang categories, the commander of the Chinese Expeditionary Force in India, Luo Zhuoying, came to Calcutta to try to negotiate with the sailors and try to persuade the sailors to join the corps. But the negotiation failed, and this very angry Chinese seamen even kicked the Luo Zhuoying away. Luo Zhuoying was barely escaped under the guard of his bodyguard and run away back to Remga, the base of the Chinese Expeditionary Force. Then what happened is the December 4th incident. When the Chinese government and the British government were frustrated of the reaction of the Chinese sailors, they decided to take some enforcement, right? So here on your left hand, you find this archive. It is said that we need to, with regard to those sailors who deliberately didn't join the corps, we, which means the British and the Chinese government, need to mobilize them, need to refer to the total mobilization law to put them into the Chinese Expeditionary Force, which means that we arrest all these unlawful Chinese sailors and bring them to Remga to enlist them into the army, and then we can take some legal actions against them, right? So on the morning of December 4th, 1942, when some 400 or 500 Chinese seamen were again demonstrating and protesting in front of the Chinese consulate in Calcutta, is this building. Still today is still this building, right? In front of the Chinese consulate, some thousands of Chinese military police and Indian policemen encircled these Chinese sailors and arrested them all. And on the night of this day, all of these sailors were sent to Remga, the base of Chinese Expeditionary Force. Then what happened in Remga when these sailors were arrested? Interestingly, because at that time Remga was run by Americans, because it was American-supported military base to train Chinese soldiers there, right? But I went to Washington, D.C. and checked the National Archives in D.C. and I checked the American archives. I found that Americans didn't like these sailors enter into Remga base at all, right? And if you read this this archive find that American officers in controlling the base said that we refuse to permit their entry. They didn't want to these Chinese sailors being arrested but enter into their base. And again, we find that the Americans said that it is probably these sailors, these seamen will be returned there. There means Calcutta after a few weeks discipline here, which means that the Americans, although under the pressure of the Chinese, accepted these arrested sailors, but they secretly released these arrested Chinese sailors and returned them back to Calcutta. You may ask why the Americans didn't like to enlist these Chinese sailors, because the answer is quite simple, that the Americans didn't think that these sailors can be turned into efficient soldiers. And the Americans didn't want to waste their resources on training these troublemaking sailors. So they just sent them back without noticing the Chinese government. So these sailors again returned to Calcutta and again joined the local gambling business and the local opium down business, right? So it's not only the sailors who make travels, there are also some other people who are also making travels at that time in Calcutta. That's the second chapter story. A man whose name is Chen Mengzhao, he established a storeroom in Park Street, Calcutta. And he ran a very big, very large scale smuggling gun at that time in Calcutta. So what happened to Chen Mengzhao, and what's Chen Mengzhao's story can tell us? In 1943, October 1943, if we check these all Chinese, official Chinese newspapers, October 1943, you find this news that a man whose name is Chen Mengzhao and his collaborator Ge Zunxian were executed by the Chinese government. We find almost all Chinese official newspapers at that time reported this case, which means that this case was quite important, right? Otherwise, they will not report this case. But who were Chen Mengzhao, who were Ge Zunxian? Why they were executed? Just because they were smugglers? And their smuggling is quite interesting because they collaborated with an American pilot whose name is Ke Lai'er. And who was this Ke Lai'er? Why a Chinese smugglers collaborated with American pilots? And what kind of the commodities they were smuggling? Right? So the story began from 1941 when the Japanese invaded Burma. At that time, Chen Mengzhao was a businessman in Burma, so he fled into India. Right? Then in India, in Calcutta, he found that a business is very lucrative, very profitable. That is India-China smuggling. We find that at that time, people have already noticed that the Zhongying 航空线是指走私 smuggling between India and China was very, very profitable. That if you buy something valued with 10,000, 16,000, and then you smuggle them into China, you can get a very large profit. And who were running this smuggling? A lot of people, not only Chinese. We find that American pilots were very big player of this smuggling business. And not only American pilots, it's also the American volunteer group or Flying Tiger pilots, the 飞虎队 in Chinese. And also Red Cross members, 红十字会 Red Cross members, and someone from British and Indian and Chinese civilians. So all kind of people are joining this very profitable India-China smuggling. And Chen Mengzhao was very smart, and he hired a man whose name is James Curler, who was the pilot of the China Airline. So China Airline was, had some American pilots, right? And he also contacted one of his friends, Ge Zunxian, who was the staff of the Chuankang Bank in Chengdu. Okay. Then they had a gun, right? They organized a smuggling gun. Chen Mengzhao was responsible for buying commodities in Calcutta. And most of these commodities are medicine and watch. Okay. You may ask why it's medicine and a watch. Medicine, of course, understandable, right? Because it's very, very difficult to get medicine in wartime China. And a watch is also very, very, very valuable in Chinese market because it's very, very easy to bring in your hand and smuggle into China, right? And it's valuable. So Chen Mengzhao made a big profit by running this smuggling gun. And he even got the money to rent a 3-floor office and open his own company, MC Chen Trading Corporation Indian branch on 12 Stephen Court, 18 Park Street, Calcutta. This building, still here. This building is here. Actually, it's here. You can still find this building today in Calcutta. And it's not only Chen Mengzhao. Actually, at that time in Calcutta, a lot of Chinese, just like what I said, right? A lot of Chinese joined this business, and they have different identities. There's a man whose name is Gao Wenjie, right? He is a Chinese civilian, but he bought some fake officer identity card and pretended to be a Chinese officer, because if you are a Chinese officer at that time, you were exempted from check in the airport by the Indian custom. So if you want to smuggle some commodities out of India without check or without being checked, right? You'd better to buy a fake military officer card or military officer document or fake passport, whatever that can cover your identity. And Gao Wenjie was this man. He bought a fake passport and stored all of his commodities in Chen Mengzhao's storehouse, because Chen Mengzhao was not only running his own business, he also rent his office to some others to store their smuggling goods and their smuggling commodities, right? And in addition to Gao Wenjie, we also have Wang Yan. Wang Yan was not a fake Chinese officer. He's a real Chinese officer sent by the Yunnan government to India to smuggle for the Yunnan government. You may find that, oh, government also joined the smuggling business. I said, yes, because at that time, all Chinese provincial and local governments want to do their own business. So they sent their own officers to India, but it's not allowed by the Chinese central government and not allowed by the Indian government. So they can do something. The local government and the provincial government send their agents to India to smuggling for the local government, especially for these medicines. So Wang Yan also put all of his commodities in Chen Mengzhao's office. But unfortunately, that the Indian police cooperated with the Chinese consulate, arrested Chen Mengzhao in January 1942. But the interesting point from this story is that the Chinese government was so frustrated and so angry with this Chinese cooperation with foreigners in smuggling goods into India, right? We even have a whole collection of archives. It said, 我注印不孝军人走私, which means the military personnel participated in the smuggling. So the Chinese government secretly set up a lot of checkpoints at Calcutta's airport to try to prevent these military personnel and the Chinese officials from smuggling, right? But look, it's a violation of Indian sovereignty, right? You, as a foreign government, you cannot set up your own enforcement checkpoints in a foreign land, right? So when the Chinese government set up these these checkpoints to try to arrest Chen Mengzhao, Gao Wenjie, and Wang Mian, the Indian government got very anxious, got very, very nervous, because in the eyes of the Indian government, smuggling is okay, but Chinese government's intervention in the smuggling is not okay. It's very dangerous. It's dangerous because, look, if we read this piece, you find that the British government thought that the Chinese had a policy to establish for its overseas nationals a special position, amounting in practice to a kind of extraterritoriality. If you know what is extraterritoriality, you find that it happened in Shanghai. Shanghai's concession is extraterritoriality, right? But now the British government in India, they were afraid that the Chinese going to establish a concession in Calcutta by encouraging their officials establish these checkpoints at Calcutta's airport and other places. So it's deepening the colonial anxieties, right? And it's not only the smugglers deepening the colonial anxieties. Also, we have deserters. In the third chapter, we find some deserters. Who are they? We find a case whose name is Chen Jingnian. This case is very interesting because, you know what? Because I got the inspiration from a very famous book, history book written by Martin Gay. That book is about imposter, and I find this Chen Jingnian is also an imposter. He's a deserter, and his imposter is also a deserter. And they came to India, deserted from the Chinese expeditionary force, and maybe joined the smuggling, local smuggling, and local maybe opium guns, right? And caused both the anxiety of the Chinese nationalist government and the British colonial authorities. So the case of Chen Jingnian, what I want to say is to show you how this narrative, official narrative of China's war against Japan in India can be reviewed, can be revised, can be rewritten, right? And according to this Chinese deserter story, it is said that the Chinese soldiers fleeing to India, they are not actively trying to go to India to be trained by Americans and fight against the Japanese. The Chinese soldiers try to go to India because they want to get better treatment, higher salary, and even want to go back to Myanmar to loot the Burmese. Okay, and interestingly, again, when the Chinese soldiers go to India, join the Chinese expeditionary force in India, they deserted from the units again, right? Because they find that it's better for them to find job opportunities in India instead of joining the army under the training and go to the battlefields. And these deserters caused big problems in India, in Bombay, in Calcutta, right? They were running secret societies, they were running gambling houses, they were running brothels. In this piece of archives, you will find that the Chinese consulate in Calcutta reported to Chongqing that these deserters, they had a secret society which with the name 太平洋俱乐部 Pacific Club. And these deserters turned troublemakers. They bullied the local Chinese a lot, and they even have some weapons in hand and killing people in Calcutta. So they were very troublemaking in the eyes of the Chinese nationalist government. And if you remember in 1942, when the Chinese deserters, right, were having their secret societies and were running their business, Chiang Kai-shek was attending this Cairo conference in Cairo with Churchill and Roosevelt. So at that time, Chiang Kai-shek was trying to bring China to the status of a great power, an equal great power to Americans and the British. Right? So how could a great power allow its citizens to make travel in its allies' name, right? And also, how could you, China, the leader of a great power, leader of the nationalist China, allow your soldiers deserted from your army? So it's all about Chiang Kai-shek's face. When Chiang Kai-shek learned the story that a lot of his soldiers in India deserted from the army, he got very angry. And he ordered, personally, the Chinese consulates across India to check these smugglers. And here we find another archive, 印度禁赌及华侨败类开设赌场. When we find that most of these 华侨or overseas Chinese are these Chinese smugglers and deserters. And when they deserted from their army, they organized the secret societies. And in addition to boarding and hijacking the Chinese in Calcutta, they also have their own gambling houses. So for this reason, the Chinese nationalist government began to send a lot of Kuomintang categories to India to try to secretly arrest these smugglers and bring them back to China to prosecute them, to bring them to the court. Right. So that's the Chinese state building in India. But this kind of the Chinese state building again provoked the British colonial anxieties. We find here this document from the National Archives in India, right? And the British intelligence office were very nervous and very concerned at this Chinese government activities in India. They said that the Chinese deserters and the Chinese government's measures against them will actually join the Chinese conspiracy. And the purpose is to establish, as I just showed you, establish extraterritoriality in India, in Calcutta in particular. Right. So they saw that these Chinese deserters and the Chinese government's categories in India should be addressed from a security point of view. So from 1943 onwards, in the eyes of the British Indian government, the biggest threat is not from Japan, it's not from Soviet Union, it's from China, it's from the nationalist government of China. They were worried that the nationalist government of China want to do something very bad. If it's not a colonization, but want to do very bad to overthrow the British rule in India, in South Asia, right? So lastly, the fourth chapter is about the flying training school in Lahore. Although Lahore is not nowadays in India, it's in Pakistan now, but at that time it's a very important city in British India. And this story is about the Indian origin of China's modern Air Force. It's also a very little-known story because we know that during Second World War, a lot of hundreds of Chinese pilots went to America under the training of the Americans and then come back to China to fly their aircraft to fight against the Japanese, right? But the little story is that most of these Chinese pilots were first of all under training in India before they were brought to the United States. The story is that the Americans, British, and the Chinese reached an agreement that most or all Chinese pilots first of all need to go to India under the training in the Lahore Elementary Flying Training School. If they were qualified enough, they will be brought to United States for advanced training. So most of them will actually receive their elementary training in India, in Lahore, in this flying training school with Indians together, right? And from April 1943 to June 1946, 25 courses in total were launched in Lahore. And 2,000 Chinese cadets. Wow, 2,000 is not a small number, right? And 1,000 Chinese aviation mechanics were under training in Lahore Elementary Flying Training School. And when these Chinese pilots and mechanics came to Lahore, arrived in Lahore, they also have very active exchanges with their Indian counterparts, the Indian Royal Air Force. And these Chinese pilots with their aircraft also participated in the local Indian civil ceremonies. So they have quite a lot of interactions with Indian professionals, Indian citizens, Indians, right? So this kind of interaction actually worried the British a lot. From the very beginning of the launch of this flying training school, the British were very worried of this existence, right? From different social archives in India and in UK, we find that from the very beginning, the British said that the Chinese were already showing most embarrassing disposition to meddle in internal Indian politics that may antagonize Muslims and princesses, and so further aggravated a difficult position in India. And look at this sentence. If their interferences has behind it moral effect of a very substantial Chinese forces, in particular the Chinese Air Force in the India or on India soil, it will be more embarrassing still. And more embarrassing is that the Chinese officers and pilots in India, they didn't salute to British officers, right? So here we read this. It is probably that the Chinese were aiming at building up an air force when they would have at their disposal after the war. So after the war, when the Chinese train their air force in India, and they will use this aircraft, they use these pilots fight against the British in India. So that is what the British worried about. And also the Chinese had a great influence on local Indians. It is said that Chinese personnel had omitted to pay compliments such as saluting, especially when he was being walking in the grounds of his own hospital. And this naturally has a very bad effect on his patients who were all Indian. Look, if a Chinese working in the hospital, if a Chinese officers working in a hospital didn't salute to British, and all Indians witnessing this very in the eyes of the British, very unpolite behavior, then Indians will just follow the Chinese behavior, didn't salute or pay respect to the British, to their British colonizers. Then the British colonial rule in India is over, right? That's why the British were very unhappy, very uncomfortable with these Chinese military facilities in India, and tried to find every opportunity to drive these Chinese pilots out of India. So in the end, I want to say that all of these British colonial office or British internal office archives were inherited by the independent post-colonial Indian government. So here I just had a dialogue with another scholar, and nowadays there are quite a lot of studies about this epistemic anxieties or colonial anxieties, right? But my understanding is that we can just push our understanding further step, that the post-colonial states, do they have colonial studies, colonial anxieties? My study shows that of course they have. Take this case of India. Almost all of these colonial office archives were inherited by their Indian counterparts. When the British left India, right, these archives were still left in India, left in Calcutta or in New Delhi. And their Indian counterparts inherited these archives, and their Indian officers read these archives. When you read these archives, you inherit the anxieties, you inherited the colonial mindset, right? So most of these Indian officers, intelligence officers in particular, they thought that the Chinese intentionally try to colonize India, try to do something bad to India, right? It's not only about these geopolitical issues, it's about these post-colonial anxieties, right? So my whole argument is that this kind of the inheritance of these colonial anxieties, how this colonial anxiety shaped contemporary, even contemporary Asia's geopolitics. in the very end, my book has some reflections on historiography and scholarship in general. First of all, I want to reflect something about the nationalistic narrative on the Chinese expeditionary force. Today, of course, I admit that there are a lot of scholarship on the Chinese expeditionary force. But the problem is that all of these narratives are not historically correct. If not correct, if not, I mean, these narratives are fabricated. If not fabricated, but at least they are not correct. Right? They are not reflecting what really happened in India for this Chinese expeditionary force. For example, if you take a look at some documentaries or novels or literatures on this Chinese expeditionary force history, you will find no Indians appeared. You will find that these guys, these Chinese, are not training in India, right? Nothing about India. You can put them to any other country in the world. They were on the training. They were very patriotic. They were loyal to the Chinese nationalist government. They want to fight against the Japanese. That's all. But in the end, they were training in India. What is their Indian experience? What's the impact, in fact, their existence in India on Indian history? Right. So I think this book is something more about this, against this nationalist narrative on the Indian, on the Chinese expeditionary force. Secondly, it's against these elitist narratives on India-China connections. When we talk about the India-China connections in history, we talk about Buddhist, right? And for modern history between India and China, we talk about something intellectuals, right? Like Tai Ming-shan, like Tang Yuwei, right? Like Tiger, Rabindranath Tagore, or like Chiang Kai-shek's visit to India and Chiang Kai-shek's talk with Gandhi and Nehru. That's all. It's all about these political and intellectual interactions, but it's not about the support. It's not about this Chen Jingnian or Chen Mengzhao, these ordinary people. But let's remember, during Second World War, 10,000 or 100,000, at least 100,000 Chinese ordinary people, most of them supporters or ordinary people, entered into India or South Asia, and they earned their own livelihood by using their own ways, cheating, making fake passport, right, or become an imposter, something like that, right? But what's their own story and how this ordinary Chinese shaped the Indian-China relations. And finally, this book is something about the new perspective on overseas Chinese. When we talk about the Chinese in India, very few Chinese in India. They cannot compare with Chinese in Thailand, Chinese in Indonesia or Malaysia. So it becomes a marginalized sector among the studies, among the scholarship overseas Chinese. But this study, my study shows that they are not that kind of the insignificant. They are very significant. If we study Chinese in India from the perspective of colonial anxieties and Chinese modern state building, right? So hopefully that this book will help you understand and have some new and fresh understandings of the whole story. And I wish you like this book. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Soin. That was really fascinating. I think you have pointed out some key aspects of both studying China-India connections in the first half of the 20th century, as well as looking at overseas Chinese communities and where the community in India fits. I would welcome people to type in their questions in the Q&A box. I'll ask them on your behalf. But to start with, Tawin, I mean, the fascinating part of your research is about the using of archival sources, right? And from different parts of the world. And then, you know, Anne Stoller has also criticized the imperial archives, right? And Nick Dirks, for example, how the perspective that we get from the archives are the state perspectives. So is the state making things up in order to create this kind of impression that many of these people are not good people, they are hooligans? You can of course argue that not all Chinese in India were involved in smuggling. There were other people who were doing their own business. They were doing their livelihood. So how much trust should we have on these archives? Because these are all state writings, right?
Right. Thank you, Hansen. And of course, one of the very regretful thing in my book is that we claim that we are doing a supporting history, but we are using official archives. I think that's the weakest that people can attack me from this angle, right? So you never interview these people or even interview the granddaughters, grandsons of these people and doing some oral history and give the supporters own voice. That's, of course, I admit this is the weak point of the book. But my argument here is that we have these official archives, but we can read them from different perspectives. We can extract some interesting stories from the archives and point out that we shouldn't 100% trust the content of what the officials tell us, but still we can tell something from these archives, right? So I think, yeah, I'm using official archives and different kinds of official archives, and almost all of them, of course, reflect the government's perspective on what's going on in India. Of course, I don't trust them. And one interesting story is that in post-war, I think, Kenson, you know that story, but most of our audience didn't know the story, that the imposed one is that a Chinese smuggler whose name is Chen Jingnian, and he came to India and he deserted from his unit and he ran away, and then Chinese and British government want to hunt him down, right? And then the British government arrested a man whose name is Chen Jingnian, and finally they find that they got the wrong people because there are two Chen Jingnian with the same identity card number, right? And I find it's very interesting because in the archive written by the British, they insisted that they got the right person. Although I can feel that they are very unsure that they got the right person, but yet insist. That's the colonial anxieties. That's what we can get from the archives. We shouldn't trust the content of the archives, but we can get the feeling, we can get the grain, just like Enola Story said, that we can feel the grain of the archives, right? That's very interesting. That's, I think, the happy moment, maybe the happiest moment I read all of these official archives, that, wow, I can see that they are cheating themselves in their archives. These government officials, when they write down these things, they are not very sure what they are writing down, but they must write down to ensure that their superior officers can just cover up this case. So yeah.
Right. I mean, I'll come back to the colonial anxieties. I think that's a very important point. But Joyny Banerjee, as you know, who is also working on the Chinese community, she has looked at Chinatowns in Kolkata from a geographical perspective, is asking the question here about what do you see the relationship between these deserters, the seamen, and the other Chinese communities in Calcutta? Because other than the state, right, other than the Kuomintang state and the British state in India, the local Chinese also had a perception of these deserters or the seamen. They were new to Calcutta. They came during the Second World War. And as you know, in current times as well, when there is this distinction between the old migrants and the new migrants in Singapore, for example, or Southeast Asia, did you get any perception from the other Chinese, or do you know what kind of interactions took place between these people? Were they accepted by the Chinese communities or not?
Yeah, that's very interesting, because one case, I think I mentioned this case, that there's a Taiping俱乐部, or Pacific Club, right? And most of these participants and insiders of this Pacific Club were deserters, were Chinese deserters. And they bullied the local Chinese, I mean, these Chinese Indians, because at that time, most of the Chinese Indians, they run their business in Tangier, right? They have this leather industry in Tangier. They have quite a lot of factories and stores in Tainan, right? So the Chinese deserters, they know that they are wealthy Chinese here, there, right? They have factories. Say, oh, let's go to there. We have guns because they're deserters. When they deserted from the unit, they got their guns with them. So they have guns. They even have grenades, and they had conflict with the local Chinese. And local Chinese were very unhappy with these newcomers, so as we said, right? But although they were very unhappy, and actually they were with the nationalist government, they were with this Chinese consulate in Calcutta. So they tried to get the help from the Chinese consulate in Calcutta. And then we go back to the sailors. And according to the story of the sailors were very unhappy with the Chinese consulate in Calcutta. Right? They thought that the Chinese consulate in Calcutta betrayed the Chinese sailors. So Chinese sailors combined, allied themselves with Chinese deserters. And they again go to Tsinghua, to Boli, and to even burn down a lot of these stores of local Chinese. So of course, were a lot of conflicts, that there are a lot of, not as we suppose that some kind of a friendship or a good relationship. I mean, in my knowledge, a lot of conflicts, a lot of fightings. But the local Chinese, because they didn't have this kind of the weapons in their hands, so they cannot fight back. So they were a weak side in this conflict.
Yeah, I mean, it will be interesting to look at what happens after 45, because there's a civil war taking place in China. And the communities both in South Asia and Southeast Asia get divided among those who are supporting the Kuomintang and those who are supporting the communists, and what role these deserters play, whom they choose, because, you know, the treatment of these soldiers in the PRC was little timid after PRC government was established. So I wonder what these deserters were doing after 45. Your story ends in 45, but between 45 and 49, and continuing to 1950s, when the consulate in India, you know, is now changes from KMT to communist, and what kind of relationship takes place between the communities in Kolkata and the consulate will be fascinating. So Chang Yanxiu, Cao Yan, you can take a look at the question as well. Chang Yanxiu is from SSRC. He has two questions. One, you pointed out, you know, the British were concerned about the extraterritoriality in India, how the KMT was trying to set up its own organizations. But were the British also demanding or doing something similar in their concession area in China, right? Especially with the celebrated abolition of this in 1943. So was it a back and forth between the British concerns in India and their concerns in China? And then the colonial anxiety part. So you said the colonial anxiety part existed among the Indians, which certainly did. You see it in the files, the archival files. Was there similar colonial anxiety among the Chinese as well after the British left India? So were the Chinese also concerned about what happened during the colonial period and how India, an independent India, might impact China?
Thank you, Tenzin. I'm just answering your question very briefly. That how about this post-war relationship, right? The deserters. What was their experience after the war? Unfortunately, that most of them were repatriated back to China just before the war. Because I didn't have the time to mention that in early 1945, the British government and the Chinese national government, they cooperated and organized a large-scale campaign in Calcutta, trying to hunt down all suspected Chinese deserters. So it's very interesting because the Chinese government were very angry at these Chinese deserters. Then they said, okay, now the Indian government, you can arrest anyone you suspect that they are deserters and bring them to us, and we will bring them to Ranga, and that's all. So it's against the original intention of the Chinese nationalist government, because if we remember, in 1940s, the Chinese nationalist government tried to present itself as a great power, as an equal power. So it did a lot of things, try to promote the status of the Chinese, right? But in the case of the Chinese deserters, in this specific case, that they just said, okay, now you British, you can arrest anyone you suspect that it is he's a deserter. So a lot of hundreds of Chinese men were arrested in Calcutta at that time by the British and sent to Ranga, right? And they were detained in Ranga until the end of the war. But there's another interesting story I mentioned in my deserters chapter, because until the end of the war, 1945, August 1945, these guys were still detained in the prison. No plane, no aircraft came from Kunming to take them back to China. Because it's an outbreak of the Chinese Civil War. And the Kunming's police force were overmanned because they were trying to, fight against the communists in Kunming. Yeah, at that time, in December 1945, there was a communist uprising in Kunming, and all Kunming's military police were deployed on the streets to try to hunt down the communists. So they didn't have even a single military police to come to Calcutta and Ranga to take these deserters back to Kunming until June or May 1946. It's 1 year after the war that finally they got 2 military police came to Calcutta and take all of these deserters back to Kunming. But that's very dramatic, I would say. That's very dramatic. When these deserters, hundreds of deserters, were brought back to Kunming, the Kunming court said, okay, all of the deserters are not the deserters. They were just the ordinary Chinese citizens who unfortunately lost their passport, right? So they were not criminals. They were not deserters. So we have to set them free. But because nowadays it's very chaotic outside, right? And in case they didn't have place to stay, they didn't have place to eat, we enlist them into our military police to fight against the communists. So again, these deserters become soldiers again and join the Chinese Civil War. So there's a continuity here from Second World War to Chinese Civil War. And this man always try to escape or flee from the control of the state, but in the end, they join another war, right? So it's very dramatic story. So back to Yan Chou's question, right? Can I see Yan Chou's question?
Yeah, you click on the answered part, answered tab.
Yeah. We find Yan Chou's question. Thank you, Yan Chou, and thank you for coming here this morning, right? And for your question that together with colonial anxieties, I wonder whether there's also a nationalist anxiety on the Chinese. That is exactly what I want to say. There are 2 types of anxieties. On one hand, we have these colonial anxieties. On the other hand, there's nationalist anxieties. And the 2 sorts of anxieties brought this misunderstanding and tensions together. So even today, we can find this kind of the anxieties that Chinese government go to overseas, try to discipline its own citizens. But this kind of the national, state building projects being misunderstood as a Chinese expansionist policy, right? So we still today we can find the kind of the misunderstandings. And I hope that my story here is try to clarify why today a lot of misunderstanding between China and India and maybe China and the United States happens due to these 2 sorts of anxieties. And when the British raised the specter of Chinese extraordinary, it's clear that with their continuing demand of extraordinary, I'm not quite sure this. Can you elaborate this?
So one is the extraterritoriality in India, right? With the British are concerned, right? But as you pointed out, the British also had a concession in Shanghai, right?
Yeah.
So are they talking about both places, or they are just concerned about what's happening in India? Inshu, if I'm wrong in interpreting that first part of the question, you can clarify. You can just type the first part of the question. I think it's a bit unclear what exactly you're asking. But Taoyin, were they also talking about what's happening in Shanghai, for example? Since you have
No,
worked on
actually,
Shanghai.
no. Of course, no. Because 1943, the British already, they give up their concession in Shanghai. They give up all of these privileges or extraterritoriality in China, right? Because of this Cairo conference, because China's status as a great power. Because I talked a lot in this book with Rara Mita, because we know Rara Mita for quite a lot of books about this China's experience during World War and how the Chinese nationalists try to promote their international status at that time. And I agree with Ramita on this case that the main arena for the Chinese nationalist government to present itself as a great power is in India. It's not in UK, it's not in the United States, it's not about Song Qingming's arrival in the United States and Song Meiling's speech in the United States. It's all about India. It's all about how to present China as a great power in India, because India is the main backyard of China's war against the Japanese. So one argument of this book is that normally we think that China's backyard, 大后方 of its war against the Japanese is in Yunnan or Guizhou or Sichuan somewhere, right? I mean, we should internationalize this perspective that India, the whole, South Asia, British India, is a real backyard. If you read these archives, all kinds of the wartime archives, you find that tens of thousands of Chinese, not only soldiers, professionals, teachers, right, go to India for training, for retreatment, for everything, for happiness, for try to smuggling some legal commodities back to China, just because their wives want to some beautiful clothes in India or beautiful watch in India. So India is really a backyard for China's war against the Japanese. That's the thing that I want to raise up, because this story had long been forgotten. Right. Even when we talk about this internationalizing China's war against the Japanese, right? 抗战的国际化，抗战史的国际化, right? We talk about United States assistance to China. We talk about the Soviet Union's role in China. We talk about the United Kingdoms. But how about India? India not only sent a small group of medics to China. That's not that's not all the case, right? We forgot all of these stories of China's experience, this ordinary Chinese experience in wartime India, and how they, influenced the later India-China relations.
Yeah, so Sawin, there are a couple of more questions here. So staying with this colonial anxiety, so one question is the anxiety different among the British government and the local Indian? So I don't know what local Indians had as agency during the colonial period, but post-colonial period, was the local, maybe this is the question is asking, was the British Raj government's colonial anxiety same as the independent India's colonial anxiety, or were they different?
I got the question that the India local and the British. What I mean is that the British Raj's colonial anxiety was inherited by the Republic of India. I mean, the independent, of course, you can say also inherited by Pakistan. It's the same, because nowadays we have these colonial studies, but it's not very much discussed in China nowadays. I had a class about the colonialism in Asia, in Tsinghua, but it's, to be honest, that it's not being discussed much in China about what is colonialism, what is colonial anxieties. But what I mean is that previously we think that independent India, independent from British colonialism, there is a breaking point between 1947 right? After 1947, Indian government is very independent. It's breakdown from colonial period. It's totally different from colonial policies or something like that. But according to our close reading and analysis of this archive, we find that there's a very strong connection between before 1947 and after 1947, and this attitude toward the China, the suspicion against the Chinese government was inherited by the independent Indian government.
Right. I mean, I think we can look at the Indian side and the Chinese side as well. The Chinese side was also quite concerned about the Indian independent government, especially with regard to Tibet, as you know, right? I mean, will the Indian government, the Indian independent government continue the policies of the British post-independence with regard to Tibet or not? So that was the concern of the nationalist government and of course the communist government as well. Is Nehru towing the line of the British or not? So the other question here, Tsaoyan, is about the Americans in India, about what kind of cooperation that the China-US had during the Second World War. Was it just publicity or propaganda, since most of the soldiers present in India from the US were perhaps not the best ones?
That's a very interesting question. You mean the question from
Chen Xuan.
Wang Chenshuan,
Yeah.
right? Wang Chenshuan. Yeah. So when did the propaganda machine take them as an example of China-US cooperation during the? I don't think it's a propaganda. Actually, according to my reading of these American archives, the Americans were quite disappointed by this Chinese existence in India. Why? Because actually the real boss is the Americans. I mean, for both British and the Chinese, the real boss is the American during the Second World War. That the American paid a lot of money, and the Lahore Elementary School, the whole cost and expenditure of the training school was paid by the Americans, and the Ranga, the training center, right, for the Chinese expeditionary force was also paid by the Americans, right? But when the Americans paid a lot, they find Chinese deserted. A lot of Chinese deserted. They even have a single document to count each month how many Chinese deserted. Next month, how many more deserted? They were so disappointed. Why these guys are deserted from? We give them a lot, right? We give them good clothing. We could give them good food. Why they deserted, right? And I have to thank the Americans because these guys deserted and these guys make troubles in Ranga and in Lahore, and the Americans write them down and write them into their archives. And then when I went to Washington, D.C. to check the archives, I find all of these records. Oh, they make a lot of troubles. And interesting is that when we study India-China relations, we neglect the American sources, archives. When I was in DC, in the National Archives in DC, College Park, I found a lot. The Americans actually recorded a lot of these Chinese activities in India. And actually, Americans, they have a quite high expectation for the Chinese, that they thought that after the war, the Chinese should take over the influence from the British in Asia, right? I mean, quite a lot of scholars have already argued this, and I think it's true that the Americans really have quite a high expectation on the Chinese nationalist government, but they were also very disappointed by the corruption of this Chinese national government's army in India. So
right. Yeah, and before we move to this very interesting question about the role of local government, I wanted to stick with the colonial anxiety. And the colonial anxiety is not just about the states, it's about the people, like the overseas Chinese people who don't have any citizenship, many of them. They are very fluid, they go from one place to another. And the result of that that we see in the late 1950s and early 60s is about the internment of the Chinese. So the Chinese themselves are suspicious, right? You see that happening with the KMT government suspecting the Chinese people. and the colonial legacy or anxiety is these people are hard to control. We don't know if they are smugglers or they are spies. So the impact is not just about the state, it's about these people who don't have really concrete identities as which nations they belong to. So that becomes an issue when PRC emerges, when India emerges. Which state do they belong to? So the people become a problem as well. And the anxiety is not just about the state, it's also about these people whose identities are not clear. So you see that as a problem. And then we see that in Indonesia as well, about the Chinese community in Indonesia or Malaysia. Which state do they belong to? That becomes an important colonial plus post-colonial issue about these kinds of people who were moving around the borders.
Yeah, I agree. I totally agree with you because this book is still, because we are using these, the limitation of the book is that its primary sources are official archives. So we can only see the anxieties of the governments, right? Yeah. So maybe next book, maybe our next project is about the support and anxieties. Of course, I totally agree with you that the people, ordinary people, they, of course, they have these anxieties, and because of the anxieties of themselves, they did a lot of things, right? And for example, I mean, in my book, I do find some ordinary people's anxieties. The imposed ones is actually the case that we find in Calcutta quite a lot of deserters. They were so anxious and worried that when the war was over, where were they going, right? Will they stay in India? If they stay in India, will they be Indians? No, right? Will be the Chinese Indians like these guys who stay in India for decades or for generations? Or will they go to Myanmar, because some of them are actually refugees from Myanmar, right? Will they go back to China? But China was in a civil war, so where they go? So I think this kind of anxieties also need to be analyzed. I think we need to be honest, we need to revolutionize our primary sources. That this book is, I have to say, this book is a little book that we didn't, and also a lazy book, because I mean, the last part of the book is written during the pandemic, and during the pandemic we cannot go outside and find these primary sources. And I'm very sorry that I didn't use these supporting voices. And I totally agree with you that we need to go to the supporters and go to themselves and to find some other primary sources to make our analysis more comprehensive.
Yeah, I know. Recently there have been books on the experiences of some of the community members, especially in the 50s, Chinatown Days, for example, and also people who were interned. They have written about their experiences. This is 50s, but still, I think there's this colonial anxiety that they are encountering in a new government in India. But so Yanqiu has clarified, and you can see his clarification that did the British actually realize that the irony of the fact that they are talking about extraterritoriality in India, where they are performing or continuing the same thing in China. I don't think the British cared about it, but do you have any response to that? I mean, did they see any irony about it while they were trying to impose it in India, but also continuing it in China?
I was just curious whether the British authorities were aware of this irony.
They may be aware, but I don't think they care. Right, Yanqiu?
I don't know. I don't know they were aware of the irony, but the thing I can see is that, of course, the Chinese, British, and Americans, they had mutual agreements that their military personnel were exempted from custom check, and their military personnel enjoyed equal privileges, which means that British military personnel in China enjoyed a privilege equal to the Chinese military personnel, their privilege in India, right? So they're same, and the it's not ironic, but I think it's embarrassing thing for the Chinese government is that a lot of Chinese military personnel made good use of the privilege for smuggling. And then there was a fake document industry in Calcutta that a lot of ordinary Chinese, they were not military personnel, right? Many ordinary Chinese merchants and businessmen know that if you were military personnel, you will enjoy privilege. Then they will just buy some fake documents to prove themselves as military personnel. And the problem at that time was that the British were unable to check who is real, who is fake, because at that time we don't have this kind of facial recognition or something like that. And more interestingly is that the Chinese nationalist government did a lot of confusing policies. For example, they sent one people from Chongqing to Calcutta. And this guy in Chongqing, he was a civilian official. And then in Calcutta, right, he became a military officer. And if you're a military officer, you enjoy the privileges. And maybe it's, following the official instruction, right? So the British were totally confused of these Chinese policies, and they cannot check. That's the one reason why the fake documents industry just prospered in Calcutta at that time. There was a lot of this. And interesting story is that a lot of Chinese newspaper published house were actually turned into these fake documents factories.
Because they had the printing press, right?
Yes.
They could print this. So one final question, Cao En, that relates to what you are pointing out from Chongqing, is the role of local governments, like the one in Yunnan that you mentioned. So where the local governments, because of the war, trying to have their own networks that are official networks that are smuggling unofficial between China and India. So they were carrying out smuggling, as you were pointing out, right? While the nationalist government, the central government is trying to put a stop to it. So a disconnect between the central government and local governments who have to survive, right?
Yeah, for the local government, the interesting thing is that actually, according to my study and my findings, most of them are corrupted officials, and your higher ranking officials, they want to earn some money, right? Because you cannot get some money in China. Then you need to send your own people to India to get this kind of smuggling profits, right? How to send your own people to India? You need to find some legal process, right? For example, in Yunnan, we have 防空司令部, and this 防空司令部 needs some medicines, right? And it's official and it's legal, and we need officials. But according to China-India agreements, any local government, if you want to buy medicine in India, you need to show Chongqing's Central Medicine Bureau to collectively procure from India, right? But this is very slow, low efficient, and maybe they will just reject your application. Then the local government, they said, okay, no, we just send a military personnel for military purpose. Send a category, for example, from Yunnan to Calcutta to learn 防空知识, right? Learn the military skills. And in fact, this guy is responsible for smuggling medicine from Calcutta to Yunnan. And this is by the order of Yunnan's, their higher ranking officials. They want to make profits by themselves by doing this. So
speaking of continuity, Cao En, you remember the recent Chinese movie, 我不是药神. It's about the cancer drug that is being smuggled from India to China. So I think there is a continuity that's going on. So just last question just came in. So if you could quickly answer that, if this is Li Ling Ting asking if there's similar smuggling issues in Southeast Asia. I'm sure there's something similar going on in Southeast Asia and the nationalist government. controlling. So is it unique essentially to
Whether
India,
there's
what you
any
were talking
smuggling
about?
in Southeast
Uh,
Asia. Of course,
or
smuggling
yeah,
everywhere from
yeah.
China. Well, the absence of presence of these issues in South. I don't think it's absence of presence of this, because you know what, I got the inspiration of writing that smuggling chapter from both the written Secret Traders and Porous Borders, right? Eric Tagnekozo, a professor from Cornell, right? I got the inspiration from that book. Indeed, I found wow, in Southeast Asia there are quite a lot of this kind of the smuggling and making a modern state, right? And how about the India-China smuggling? Then I find wow, the India-China smuggling is also very active and very worthwhile for us to analyze. And one last point is that when I'm writing the smuggling case, right, I find interesting. No, not the smuggling. It's sailors, the seaman chapter. I find a very interesting phenomenon. It's about performance, it's about the state performance, because I find at that time why the Chinese government invested a lot in organizing the sailors into some corps, right? It's, I mean, from my point of view, it's a waste. Why don't you just invest the money to organize the efficient army? Why do you send a lot of categories to India to organize these sailors and spend a lot of money? And then I find actually it's a performance. It's a performance of the Chiang Kai-shek's regime, that because this guy, at the same time, Chiang Kai-shek actually organized some yaws corps, 青年军 in China, in Chongqing and in Chengdu. 10万青年, 10万军 at that time. It is said that, and they recruited and hired a lot of tens of thousands of intellectual, educated young people into their students, into their army. And these people are not going to the battlefield to fight. These people are just do some performance for foreigners, for foreign journalists to report, right?
So Cao, were they doing the same thing in Southeast Asia as well? Were there seamen in Southeast Asia?
Southeast Asia were occupied by the Japanese.
Yeah, so that's the difference. I mean, that's what the question is asking, right? So
yeah.
The seamen issue was not similar to what's happening in India, but how about smuggling part? That was similar.
Yeah, that's similar.
But then again, the Kuomintang government didn't have any control over many of these places because it was occupied by the Japanese.
Yeah. I mean, return to the seamen. The seamen is that they think that India is a better arena than England, China, because in England, China, quite a few foreigners. So foreign reports are not adequate, right? But in India, if we can organize some highly disciplined, well-behaved Chinese, educated Chinese in the army, then all foreigners, not only British and Americans, all foreigners in India, they can report this, and it's a great achievement of the British Chinese nationalist government. So it become a performance, and the sailors themselves know well that it's a state performance, and they won't put themselves to the side of the state to cooperate with the state in this performance. So that's why the writer can.
I think this is the reason why your period is so important, because the experiences of overseas Chinese in India is very different from what's happening in Southeast Asia because of the Japanese presence in Southeast Asia, and many Chinese from different parts of Asia end up in India, including Southeast Asia. So I think this period indicates the uniqueness of the Chinese communities that's in South Asia and worth studying, because there are many different communities in India at this period. During the Second World War time, there are of course Tibetan traders and others as well. So thank you, Cao, for bringing to light some of these important case studies, and I hope it will be translated into Chinese for scholars in China to understand and perhaps enlarge the field of the study of the Chinese communities in India. And then we look forward to your next book as it comes up. You have moved from the Indians in China to Chinese in India. So maybe next book is about something else.
Next book is called China, India in Between.
In
Burma.
between. Burma, that's great. Thank you so much, Hawin, and
Thank
thank
you.
you for all the audience members for staying on. And we'll see you next month for our lecture. And Hawin, hope to see you somewhere in the world next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tencent. Thank you so much. Thank you for your time. Bye
Bye-bye.
bye.